So, at this point, we have explained the big League lore update twice already. Once in a separate 30-minute long video, and the second time in relation to how it's going to affect Riot's MMO going forward. Now, I don't really want to go through the basics again, but since it is very important for this video, hopefully this will be the last time. So here's a super TLDR version of what happened. For those of you who don't know, technically, Arcane wasn't canon. And that's because League's lore used to be a multiverse. You had the core canon universe, which was dictated by what was happening around League of Legends, as well as what was happening on the website which served as a lore archive simply called Universe. Everything you saw there was simply canon. But besides this core version of the universe, you also had other versions of League's lore, with the two big ones being Legends of Runeterra and Arcane. These two had the same core, that being the core universe, but both branched out with some differences in their stories. As a quick example, Ekko simply had wild differences between all the iterations. And as it turns out, Riot themselves were not fans of this. And so they dropped a massive lore update, where they confirmed that going forward, everything connected to League's IP will be part of the same shared universe. Meaning that now Arcane is going to be fully canon, Legends of Runeterra will smooth out the edges, with the rest of the lore being filled by what used to be core canon lore. On one side, this update is absolutely amazing. It means that this universe is getting the integrity it deserves. And no matter what part of League you like, be it the game or the media, everyone gets to enjoy the same universe. But on the other side, this update is also presenting some challenges, because since everything is canon and everything is connected now, you have to fit the entirety of Arcane into an already explored world, where all the characters who appeared in Arcane already had some roles. With that said, we already know that Arcane 2 will not exactly follow the old canon core lore. So don't worry, you won't find anything that could be considered a spoiler here. And if anything, you might learn a fun fact or two. So, without further ado, let's have a look at what the lore update actually means for Arcane. As we explained in that video from 2 years ago, the differences between all the characters in these universes were quite big. So thankfully, we don't have to remember all of that anymore, since only the Arcane version is going forward. And as a result, sometimes what we thought was real has changed. For example, in the core universe, Piltover and Zaun were always one above the other. But a lot of Arcane's plot is happening around the bridge. It's the bridge that is separating Piltover and Zaun on a horizontal level, meaning that Zaun is no longer just below Piltover. Now yes, technically Zaun is slightly downhill, because in many of the shots with the perspective from Zaun, you can see that Piltover is going up. But now, the entire city should have like an L shape, with Piltover being separated from Zaun by the river Pilt, as well as Zaun going down. Honestly, this is a change that will change the vibe of the entirety of Zaun a little bit. Because originally, Zaun was pretty much locked beneath Piltover, and it was a struggle to just get up from there. Not to mention that some of these places were simply awesome. I loved how we had the Piltovans living above in their high society, and all they had to do was to look down to see the Undercity. Now, with the change, I honestly don't know what's going on. I don't want to lose the old layout, that one was awesome. So we'll just have to wait and see how Arcane 2 is going to handle this. Although, there is another big thing that we should mention. By the end of Arcane 1, we can see how the entire city managed to build their mass relay. It's a device that can throw airships at a massive speed in any direction. It is not necessarily a teleport, but in a way it is fast travel. Which is a bit scary because this only ever appeared in Arcane. This tower was never mentioned anywhere in the entirety of the old canon lore. And I think that was on purpose, because having such a device in your world may give you the feeling of a shrinking universe. Normally this universe functioned with the assumption that traveling around the world took weeks and months. But Arcane is proposing the idea that you can speed things up significantly. And in the show, they use this system for a trade route with Noxus. So does that mean that Noxus will also build one of these so that these two places can get connected? This might get scary because now the entire world might be getting a bit more modern than we expected. So let's wait and see what Arcane 2 will do with the Noxian and Piltover relationships. So now, let's move on from the layouts. As I mentioned, when it comes to the specific characters, there is no point in remembering the old versions of the stories since only the Arcane version is moving forward. So just take that info for what it is. I don't think there is a point in comparing the two versions of the story again, especially since it is safe to just forget one of them. So instead, I'd like to talk about the differences that kinda affect the entire place. For example, there was always one more very meaningful difference between the two universes. One that a lot of the old school League lore fans will remember. For a very long time, when it came to Yordles and Piltovans were quite racist. Which is why the entire storyline with Heimerdinger brought up questions. You see, originally, Piltovans, as well as a big portion of the world, were terrified of Yordles. They thought they were devilish creatures that only caused destruction, which is understandable, mainly because in Piltover you had Ziggs running around causing mayhem. So in order to function in human society, originally, Yordles used glamour. Glamour was a kind of Yordle magic that made the Yordles look more favorable in the eyes of the beholder. In other words, all Yordles would look less dangerous. So for example, if a human looked at them, they would look like a human. Which is why, when Arcane originally came out, people thought that Heimerdinger was using glamour. And that perhaps he did look like a human to everyone else. But now it was confirmed that glamour is no longer canon. And Yordles in Piltover are simply Yordles in Piltover. Though with that said, Heimerdinger is now connected to other fun facts. You see, since it was confirmed that Arcane and Legends of Runeterra are part of the same canon universe now, it means that somehow the kind-hearted Heimerdinger which we have in the show, the one that started helping Ekko with his inventions after he got kicked out of Piltover, should somehow get the T-Hex in the future. Because yes, the T-Hex should be canon now. Like, this is technically the same character. What kind of a villainous story arc is he gonna go on? But this isn't even the funniest fun fact. You see, Arcane also gave us a number for how old Heimerdinger is. Specifically, it was mentioned that in the first part of the show he was 307, with the other half happening about 6 years later, meaning that he would be about 313, which may sound like a lot, until you realize that Heimerdinger might be one of the youngest Yordles we have. Take Poppy, for example. She was present during the foundation of Demacia, which happened over 600 years ago, which would be the youngest she could possibly be. It is more likely she is going towards 1000. So somehow she is older than Heimerdinger. But to be fair, keep in mind that Yordles come from Bandle City, which is a Yordleish realm where time passes at different rates. So maybe Heimerdinger just spent a lot more time in Bandle City compared to Poppy. So the good news is, there are ways for Riot to fix this. Or don't. I am honestly fine with Heimerdinger looking like this despite being the youngest. So, moving on, still staying around the Yordles. I honestly wonder if Arcane 2 is going to bring in Ziggs. I personally don't believe they will. Because while in the past it was cool to see Jinx and Ziggs becoming friends and causing mayhem everywhere, for Arcane 2 I don't believe Ziggs would actually make the story any better. You already have so many other characters who could use the spotlight more. Introducing even more new characters wouldn't do much. So maybe the new canon will really just put Ziggs somewhere else. Kinda like what happened in Legends of Runeterra. But on the other side, in Zone, we might get new references to another Yordle. Because looking at Legends of Runeterra, you should keep in mind that Teemo has been involved with dealing drugs in Zone in the past. And yes, some of these mushrooms appeared in Arcane before. But now, let's move away from Yordles. When we have a look at the core cast of characters, specifically Caitlyn, Vi, and Jinx, all of those are totally fine. Most of their big stories happen in the future. And I mean future probably more distant than Arcane 2. So while their stories are being changed, I'm kinda just fine with it. It's not that big of a deal, but out of all of these, Ekko is getting a little bit more interesting. First of all, his Arcane appearance simply became the canon one, which also explains why they went for this appearance for Project L. But more importantly, in the past, Ekko's origin was quite different. In the core canon, Ekko lived with his parents, who worked hard so that they could help him study in Piltover. All while Ekko wanted to stay down in Zaun and make his inventions to help people have better lives. And in fact, he often roamed the streets with a group of children called the Lost Children of Zaun. Well, in Arcane, not only is this group of kids very different, but here they are also called Firelights, which is mostly a group of orphans without a real home, which is the point of Ekko's entire storyline in Arcane. And as far as we know, Ekko should also be an orphan himself. I mean, throughout the entire series, his parents were never even mentioned. So at the very least, it is believed that he is an orphan. And the issue with that is that this would mean that the entirety of Convergence is not canon, since most of the story there happened around Ekko's parents. And this sucks because Riot Forge always released games that were fully canon in this universe. But since Arcane gets to overwrite everything, it seems like Convergence will be just left out. So at this point, who knows what's gonna happen to Ekko? His story turned into a little bit of spaghetti. We don't really know which threads of his storylines are real anymore. And to be fair, if you look at Arcane, it seems like even his old cinematic is just not gonna be canon anymore. So, will he even get to meet someone like Zeri? In the future, these two should become friends. So, we'll have to wait and see what's gonna happen there. But, moving on, after those core 4 characters, we then also have someone like Jace. When it comes to Jace, the only difference is that he is part of a different house. That's really as far as that one goes. Everything around Jace should be totally fine in the new canon lore. It's just that his story is different. Now, Viktor on the other side is gonna get a little bit more interesting. See, in Arcane 1, Viktor was absolutely my favorite character. I just loved his story arc of his body fighting against time. And the only way he could fight it was with science. And anyone who has ever even touched League will know how Viktor will end up. The thing is, the deeper you dig into how Viktor is presented these days, the more you will realize that he's gonna get evil somehow. Because in the core lore, Viktor was always a good guy. Yes, he was practicing some really horrifying things on people, but in reality, through cutting all the limbs, he was technically helping everyone. He was never doing anything to anyone against their will. But over time, as Viktor started getting more appearances, he started appearing more like a villain. Especially somewhere like in Legends of Runeterra, where he just seems to be evil. But now, since we know that that part of the story is gonna be canon, now we have to wonder, how will Viktor actually turn out to be evil? Will it be through the mind-twisting, voidy powers of Shimmer? Speaking of which, yes, I think it is pretty much confirmed now that Shimmer will be connected to the Void somehow. I mean, even in the show, Viktor created Void Core by taking the Hex Core and infusing it with his blood, which was also infused with Shimmer. You may remember this all happened during the scene where Jace was having fun. So, who knows? That entire part of Viktor's personality is now a mystery. Speaking of which, if we go with what was previously canon, then we should all remember that Blitzcrank was created by Viktor. So if Viktor goes on his scientific storyline, unless Riot just rewrites the entirety of Blitzcrank's story, at some point in Arcane 2, he should create Blitzcrank, which was a robot he originally created to help people in Zaun during all the big disasters. So is that gonna be the case? We don't know. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if they changed Blitzcrank and now Blitzcrank was created by Ekko. because if you go back to some of the older cinematics, you always saw Ekko and Blitzcrank together. Now, another a bit questionable thing we can mention is Rise. Yeah, I was always hesitant whether this actually could be Rise. But if you look at some of the behind-the-scenes footage, yeah, I think it should be. The thing is, why is he not blue? Like, we were always fine with this because before it was an alternative universe, but since now everything is canon, he should be blue. Why is he not blue? Did he paint over his skin like few years later? Like, that entire part is just confusing now, and I honestly have no idea what to think about this. Like, the only solution would be that that is not Rise. Otherwise, I'm just moving on. Another champion who might get brand new lore because of Arcane might be Twitch. Yes, you may remember that one rat who killed a cat because Singed was experimenting on it. It was a really beefy rat and it had purple eyes because of Shimmer. Just like Twitch. And because in the past Twitch never had any big stories, it is extremely likely that Twitch will now be tied to Arcane. So who knows? Maybe Twitch is gonna appear as a background character in Arcane 2. And if that happens, it should be confirmed that Twitch was created by Singed. Speaking of which, I am still sad that we are most likely losing the old version of Singed. Out of all the characters that are in Arcane, the old Singed was the only one that was absolutely better than what he got in Arcane. Now it is obvious that Singed's story will go forward in Arcane 2. But there is no way they can make his story as cool as he was before. Because in the old version, he was a proper horror-based character who did some really horrifying things to people because science. Like, he never really had evil intentions. He just had no boundaries. And that's what made him such a great character. He was probably the most horrifying character in the entirety of League of Legends. And now, he's gone. So don't worry, we still have Fiddlesticks. Also, will he actually become the father of Orianna? That's what people always assumed was teased at the end of Arcane. Which would be a little bit weird, because in the past, Orianna was the daughter of Corin Revek, who also appeared in Convergence, which would only dig the Convergence grave deeper. So yeah, I think it's possible he's still gonna be her father. But speaking of fathers, there is one that's not really a father. Anyway, Silco is now canon. What's interesting about that one is that in the past, Riot tried to turn Silco into a champion. But in the end, they didn't go through with it because Silco was not a great fighter on Summoner's Rift. It just didn't feel right running around with a dagger stabbing people. So instead, he was scrapped and we got Renata. Renata always functioned as a substitute to Silco, but that only worked while we knew that those two were separate universes. Now, Silco and Renata are both canon, with both of them being the most meaningful person in Zone. But also because the two universes used to be separate. In the past, it was confirmed that Renata's perfumes were not shimmer, despite being pink. So, will that change now? Will Renata actually be using shimmer now, as she should? Because what are they gonna do? Introduce another chemical into Zone? After already having Chemtech, Hextech and shimmer? I don't think they wanna go for that, so I have no idea what Riot will do with Renata. And lastly, there is also one more character we should mention, which is Warwick. Since everything is connected and everything is canon, a lot of the old voice lines which led up to Arcane should still hold onto the same integrity. Which means that it is extremely likely, and I'm pretty sure this is not a spoiler since this is simply in the game, that Warwick will be Vander. It is still not confirmed, but I would be surprised if he wasn't. Just don't be mad at me for spoiling something obvious. But yep, there you have it. All the interesting things to consider when diving into Arcane's lore, which is now the canon lore. What's crazy is that since everything is canon and everything is part of the same universe now, there is a lot of characters which should appear in Arcane 2. But I'm also confident in saying that they will not appear in Arcane 2. Because if they really added everyone in, it would be overflowing with new characters. But just to give you an idea, what about Urgot? around Arcane 2, we should have Urgot somewhere around Zaun. And what about Seraphine? Yes, they are changing her relation to the origin of Hextech, but while all of those stories are happening in Arcane, Seraphine should be somewhere in the city. Or what about Ezreal? He should be somewhere around Piltover 2. And don't forget about Mundo roaming the streets. You see, all of these are beloved characters, but none of them would really move the story forward. Perhaps with the exception of someone like Camille. I would actually love to see Camille in Arcane 2. That would be a very meaningful character. Though I still believe that the most we'll get will be Blitzcrank. And even that one will most likely be a lot different. So if anything, just be happy that all of these are part of the same world. And that they are somewhere. But more importantly, we should all be happy that Professor Von Yip is now canon in Arcane.